Welcome back to another episode of Media Talks TV with your host Tony J. It's going to be another segment of retrospectives. It's been a wild week today. Well, this week, considering that the great Clive Davis has died, and it's got the internet shook up. Some on two different sides of the spectrum of those that look fondly upon Clive Davis and those that really look at Clive Davis in a different light. Some say he was one of the greatest record execs of all time, but that remains to be seen because even in good intentions, you could still have bad intentions. And that's what everybody online is talking about when it comes to the death of Clive Davis. When you talk about death, and especially when important people pass away, some are going to have good memories and then other people are going to have bad memories. It's all in how you treat people, but it's also in your intentions. And some people do things that they're not aware that they're doing. And some people might say, Clive Davis was like the rest of the record execs in the industry. Some artists fell to the wayside and some succeeded. And of course, there are the controversial ones that even to this day a lot of black folks in the world talk about, especially when it comes to TLC, Monica, Brandy, and Whitney Houston, which was one of his biggest stars. And I knew soon as I got the news in the car that Clive Davis died, I knew something in the algorithm was going to trigger Whitney Houston stories because it's this funny thing that happens soon as somebody important dies, other stories in the algorithm start coming behind it. So as soon as everybody found out Clyde Davis died, now everybody's bringing up Whitney Houston. Now you got Oprah talking about Whitney Houston and things that happened backstage and what was going on when she tried to make her comeback and her comeback album. And it just didn't make any sense. And I was like, now that Clyde Davis's name is getting dragged through the mud, now they got to bring Whitney Houston back into the fray of it. It's just like with Michael Jackson. When the Michael Jackson movie came out, now all of a sudden everybody got documentaries about the allegations and shit. Everything like social media is very funny like that. People die, important people die, then they start digging up your personal life and then they start digging up things that you did in the past and it's like you can't escape it. Well, Clive, every time somebody talked about Clive Davis online, it triggered a Whitney Houston story. So I was like, here we go. Here we go. So what I really wanted to say is, people are talking about two different sides of this. One is Clive was underhanded. Clive gave dirty deals. There's a lot that has been rumored to have been said when he was an exec at Arista and CBS Records. And then on the other hand, you know, Clive Davis helped push black talent to the forefront. Um, he gave black musicians a chance to get their talent in spaces that were once cut off from them business wise. And for the first time during the 70s, you had black artists that could now get endorsements because there was a time in the record industry where most black musicians could not get endorsements. You go back to the days of Barry Gordy and Motown. Barry Gordy had to fight to get the Supremes to get endorsements by other companies like Coca Cola to do radio spots and TV spots. When you talk about black talent getting pushed during the 70s, the 60s, and the 70s, the two names that come to mind would be Barry Gordy and Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan was one of those people that were responsible for breaking the color barrier on television because he pushed the Supremes and the Temptations to the forefront for them to get more endorsement deals. Business, the record industry before Clive Davis and after Clive Davis was vastly different. Before Clive Davis, the record industry didn't see black talent as being something that could easily make money. And if you even go further during the 50s when rock and roll became a thing, they were getting no endorsement deals. When you had people like Jerry Wexler had to change the he had to change the current environment so that black talent could be recognized because record companies weren't really banking on black talent. They allowed them to make records. They allowed them to do concerts. But the hardest thing, of course, for black musicians was going down south and being able to do concerts during the Jim Crow era. Well, Jerry Wexler changed all that. When you went to a record store in the 40s and the 50s, black music was relegated to what they called colored records. Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records and Ahmet Itigun had to change the atmosphere for R&B and blues and rhythm and blues. That's why we got the names of the genres for black music so that they wouldn't be defined as simply black music or colored music. He gave it different names so that when you go into a record shop now, okay, that's R&B, that's jazz, that's funk. Jerry Wexler was able to categorize the music by its genres and its subgenres. Back then, black music didn't have subgenres. It was called colored records, colored music. That's how the white record industry gave it its spin. Then by the 60s, it just seems like, okay, well, now because of Motown, it broke barriers. So now we got soul music, we got R&B music, and then they could do concerts where the audiences were integrated. But then there's the world after the Lou Wassermans and the Jerry Wexlers and the Ahmet Itiguns of the world, which were the biggest record labels of all time. When Clive went to CBS Records, and he started hosting Black Talent. Well, then Black Talent started getting more PR, press. They started getting more interviews. And of course, Soul Train opened that up for black musicians to get more exposure and more recognition for their music. And then Clive Davis was helping that, and Clive helped to bring small black record companies into the fold of the larger record companies. And by that time, there was only two places that made the record industry. There's New York, and then there's Los Angeles. New York and Los Angeles had corporatized all of the distribution for all the small record labels. So when we get to the early 70s, Clive comes in, and of course this is where it kind of goes downhill. And this is kind of like the sticking point for a lot of black folks and how we, celebrate the life of Clive Davis. And that was with how we how he had dealings with Stax Records. Stax Records, of course, with Al Bell, they had this business deal, and Clive made a deal with Al Bell to do distribution of all Stax Records and all Stax artists. That included Isaac Hayes, and they started funding for the movie Watt Stacks and making the records. And this how Shaft got its big huge exposure, was through Clive Davis. And it just kind of like after the success of Shaft, the whole dealings with Clive and Stax kind of went to shit, and it collapsed a thriving black record company. And of course, we all know that story of how he changed the record industry. He made departments for black artists. He had departments at CBS. He had these things to focus squarely on how do we market black music. And this is where, with the new industry that he helped spearhead, to corporatize black music, but at the cost of the artist, because they were signing these deals that ultimately had them kind of cut out of their royalties. And I know a lot of people are going to talk about this, and a lot of people are going to debate what Clive Davis's legacy is. Yes, he discovered Whitney Houston. Yes, he did a lot of things for black music, but he also screwed over Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman was one of the greatest jazz artists of all time. She struggled to get her music recognized and get her music played on the radio. And because Clive was such a big machine during that time, he shelved Phyllis Hyman's whole musical career. She had to move from one record company to the next to get her music heard. She didn't get the full exposure that she truly deserved, even though she had a solid fan base. But unfortunately, Just like the record industry, you know, they could snap their fingers and you could be blackballed. Or they what they do is they shelve you because they don't know how to promote you. They keep you on the label, you keep producing records, but then your records don't get promoted. Same thing happened to Rick James, a lot of other artists during that time period because all their focus was at the time on disco. And Clive was a part of that era where if you weren't doing things that were a lot more marketable, they would set you aside. And that's how record companies started playing a lot of artists. He did the exact same thing with TLC. TLC had hit record after hit record, but they weren't making any money. Clive also tried to pit Monica against Brandy in terms of trying to make record sales. It's these little games that and trickery that record companies were playing in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And then, you know, a lot of record companies now have learned from Clive Davis and they've taken that into the record industry and exploited a lot of up and coming artists for their royalties and for their their a lot of their their publishing. And that's what's so troubling. One can't excuse the other when talking about Clive. There's a history. And with Clive Davis dying, it's kind of like the old world of the record industry kind of dying off. Because you notice a lot of artists today, and I wanted to segue this into a music another video about this because I was originally going to talk about what was happening with Lizzo and her music and a lot of other artists' music is starting to flop. The industry has changed so much, but it's a world far removed from what Clive Davis was a part of. He made a musical blueprint. He created that machine for a lot of artists to get screwed over. And like I said, the corporatizing of black music and how black music kind of gets controlled by these corporate entities and you're an artist and you don't really understand what's going on until the checks start drying up and you end up broke and you don't get residual off of whatever you created with the record company. He created that monster. He created that machine that churns out artists and kind of screws them for every penny that they have so that when they're in debt, then what happens is they end up having to do tours in order to recoup what they spent in the studio. So they give them all this money. They give them all this cars and the credit cards to buy all this stuff. And then before you know it, they have to go back in the record in a recording studio, make another record to recoup what they had spent. And then they got to go out on tour and do tours for a year and a half. And then when they finish fucking touring, Now they got to get back in the studio and make another and cut another record. And it's like it was this thing like this is where the modern record industry comes from Clive Davis because CBS Records was a corporate entity unto itself. Same thing with Warner Brothers Records. All these record companies from New York to LA, they had a stranglehold on black music. And while we can be grateful to the person that Clive Davis was, but he was a part of a machine. And even that machine, being a music mogul and having all of these talented black artists, you're finding out that many of these music artists that we love and cherish are ending up broke. You know, people having to fight for their residuals, fight for their publishing. Some people die and don't get to see a penny of their money and their hard work. And that's what being in the record industry was like for a lot of black artists, especially in the 70s and the 80s, where there was still a lot of transitioning. When I think about a lot of artists, you know, a lot of artists had to switch up their music during the mid to late 70s for disco. So then they had to been forced to make disco records to stay relevant, even though they started out doing soul music. It was like record companies were forcing their hand to do disco cuts. And it was crazy, and it's one of the most contentious times for a lot of record recording artists. A lot of guys came up under Clive Davis. Some of them don't even realize, if it wasn't for Clive, there wouldn't have been a Bad Boy Records. There wouldn't have been a So So Death or a LaFace Records. He allowed a lot of black artists to become their own bosses, but he still had to get his cut, and Arista had to get their cut too. And the thing that makes the record industry interesting during the 80s and the 90s is that a lot of larger distribution companies were buying small record companies, small black record companies. And a lot of those record companies, a lot of those large recording distribution like BMG and MCA and and Sony and CBS and Warner Brothers Records, they all got the catalogs of a lot of black artists. And sometimes when these artists go into debt, they have to sell their catalog back to the record company in order to recoup whatever money that they have. But then they end up not having that leverage anymore, even though they have a body of work. Person can be dead and they'll repress a greatest hits album. And I started noticing that, you know, every artist that I grew up listening to, these major record companies, because they wanted to make money off of the music catalogs, they would they would press these redundant records. Oh, number one hits, the greatest hits of. That shit started under Clive Davis. It's the greatest hits of, the number one hits, and the hits, the hits, the hits. That they take some of their number ones, they put it on a compilation record and then they just push it out and press it out and press it out and keep constantly pressing and pressing and pressing and pressing. And you go to a record store and you see you just brought the same fucking record when you could have brought the whole entire record. But this is what record companies do to recoup whatever they can pull out of the artist, even when the artist is dead. So you got a lot of dead black artists that still have not recouped any of the money from the music that they put out. And then they take the music and then they could press it and put it in commercials. And then they won't see a dime of that money. Not even from that. Their families won't even see a dime of that money when they die. Look at how they did Jackie Wilson. Look at how they did Frankie Lyman. Two primary examples of how the record company jerks around black artists for their royalties. And it's always been like that. Barry Gordy played the same fucking game too. They're all about the money. And this is one of the things about the record industry now. It don't pay now to be a rapper or a singer because what the record industry has become now is far from what Clive Davis used to put out, and that was the talent. People not making money off of streams and clicks. They're losing all of this money because the record industry isn't invested in artistry anymore. Whereas though Clive was invested in the artistry of black music. But now, because you don't have him no more, what are the last music moguls left? You got Jermaine Dupri, you got, but I'm talking about the bigger ones. Lou Wasserman is dead. Jerry Wexler is gone. Ahmet gone. Um, I mean, Morris Levy. Those guys, those were the hardcore guys. Those guys fucked over a lot of black artists. Morris Levy. Um, what's the other guy? I forgot his name, but damn if they didn't fuck over a lot of people. Leonard Chess from Chess Records. A lot of record companies. And I would go as to say Sylvia Robinson from Sugar Hill Records because after after that incident with Grandmaster Flash and Furious Five, they didn't even tell you by the time they got to the mid 80s, they removed Grandmaster Flash's name from all the records and then just put the Furious Five on there featuring DJ Grandmaster Flash. And they started doing that shit. And I knew, and I was like, huh? Like they removed him because he was at first he started off as the front man, and then he just they kind of removed his name off the record, so they ain't got he don't get the credit or he don't get the royalties. Geffen Records was another one. Also, Solar Records, Dick Griffey used to put his name on all the artist records. Used to strong arm the shit out of for royalties. A lot of those artists, when they left, they ended up broke. So many artists got that mentality and that blueprint from Clive Davis. Because Clive changed the music world in a way where corporate interests started getting involved in music. He was the reason why corporations saw viability in hip hop, because back then they said, well, there's no money in hip hop music. Clive proved that wrong with Bad Boy. He put all his money towards Bad Boy, and when he put all his money towards So So Def, that's when things started taking off for hip hop. Then it became a multi-million-dollar entity because of that. So I give credit where credit is due. I don't know how you guys might feel about it. Leave a comment in the comment box. Tell me what you think. What do you think about Clive Davis's legacy? Because for me, I'm looking at it on both sides. I'm looking at it from a point of view of it being, he made a blueprint, but I also, he made a blueprint for black music to get recognized. And then on the other hand, he created a corporate monster for black musicians not to get the credit for the music that they create, and not to be paid fairly for the music that they create. And when I think about TLC and what happened to them as a group, I look at it like maybe in some ways Clive Davis was a very Machiavellian type of individual. But then again, somebody had to do it. This has been another Media Talks TV exclusive, another segment of retrospectives looking back on the past as we move forward into the future. I'm Tony J. Make sure you hit the like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment in the comment box telling me, you know, what do you see Clive Davis's legacy as? Thanks for watching, and I'm out. Peace.